Well, Nepomniachtchi did it. I count myself among those people that doubted him, but I was wrong. And Jan Nepomniachtchi won the 2022 candidates with room to spare. I mean, there was no question about who the best player was for that tournament. And he is now in a position to play Magnus Carlsen for the World Championship. We're still waiting if Carlsen will accept that challenge, although most of the chess world believes that he will. And the last time they played, Carlsen won the match fairly easily. Uh, However, this time, I think Nepomniachtchi has a better shot. And even Gary Kasparov himself has said that Nepomniachtchi is a pretty formidable opponent. And I think there's a good chance he's going to give Magnus all he can handle. And an example of that is this game that was played in St. Louis Rapid and Blitz. This was in the Blitz portion. This is a Jan Nepomniachtchi with the white pieces. Magnus Carlsen has the black pieces. This was a 5-minute game with a 3-second delay. Let's jump right in and watch these two giants of modern chess go at it. Nepomniachtchi begins with b3, the Larsen's opening. The original concept here was to control this e5 square, sort of a combination of b3 and f4, play bishop to b2. But as time has gone on, the opening has matured, and now you can do multiple things with it. g6 directly challenging the line, bishop to b2, knight to f6, e4. Obviously, the knight can't take the pawn because it's pinned. The rook would be captured. c5, and now Nepomniachtchi plays f4, sort of a Grand Prix formation. The concept of taking the knight has been played before, maybe not in this exact position. Karpov played it, and after ef6, the idea is you can play the knight to this weak d5 square. Having said that, it doesn't score that well in this particular position. So Nepomniachtchi plays this sort of Grand Prix idea where you're going to attack with the e and f pawns. Bishop to g7, queen to f3. The knight to f3 seems more natural and is the most commonly played move, but it scores terribly. Black has a huge plus score here. The problem is this pressure on the e4 pawn. He can't take it right now because of the pin, but the pressure on the pawn, and he ends up getting control of the light squares and doesn't work out very well. So the better move, and the better scoring move, is what Nepomniachtchi plays, queen to f3, d6, bishop to b5 check. Light squared bishops come off the board. He wants to play d3, so that's going to be the bad bishop, so he gets it off the board. Knight to e2, castles, castles, knight to c6. Of course, this is a potential square for the black pieces. e3 and b5. And in these structures, this is also similar to a closed Sicilian as well as a Grand Prix attack. Black usually plays on the queen side by expanding, and white usually plays on the king side. c4. So Nepomniachtchi challenges that space, and he says to Carlsen, I'll let you get the space, but I don't want you opening lines over there. b4, h3, the possibility of expanding, also keeping a piece, a queen or a knight out of g4. a5, and now a4 is played by Jan. And what he's telling Magnus is, if you don't retake that en passant, then the queen side over here is just going to be completely locked up and you'll have no play. And I'll be able to do whatever I want to on the king side. So Magnus really has to capture the pawn en passant, which he does. Then rook takes a3. White can work on the a5 weakness, but black can attack the weakness at b3. Rook a to b8. Bishop to c3. Attacks a5. Knight to e8. Offers the exchange of the dark squared bishops and also frees the f-pawn to go to f5 to attack white's central structure. Queen to e3 to help control the d4 square. f5, as we just mentioned, attacking the structure. Pawn takes, bishop takes g7, knight takes g7. In this structure, white wants to play the idea of d4 when he gets a chance. For knight b to c3, can pop into b5, can pop into d5, knight to e6, and black wants to control the d4 square, knight to b5. So now white's knights and queen keep black's knight from hopping in to d4. Rook to f6, rook to f3 with the idea of rook to g3, rook to g6 first, rook to g3 challenges the rook, king to f7, king to h2, queen to d8. Another reasonable option for Carlsen was just rook b to g8 and to just double on the half-open g file. Queen to d8, queen to f3, attacks the knight at c6, rook to c8 defends it, and now queen to h5 with a double attack, the pawn at f5 and the pawn at h7, and Magnus has to make a choice. Which pawn does he want to give up? He decides to give up the h-pawn. He plays knight to g7. That knight defends f5. Queen takes h7. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Queen to g8. So Magnus is willing to go into the endgame a pawn down. I think he knows he'll be worse, but perhaps he has his best chance to survive in a pawn down endgame. Queen takes, rook takes, king to f3. So we can make an evaluation here. White is a pawn up in the endgame, and that includes this nice h-pawn, which is passed. And black has a weakness on e5, but the rest of his pawn structure is quite nice and compact. And white's structure is a little bit looser. So he has a fighting chance here, Magnus does. The knight goes back to e6 again, wants to control d4. White would like to play d4 to liquidate that weakness, but he can't yet. Rook to a1 gives the rook flexibility. The rook can go behind the passed h-pawn, so it can advance. King to f6, g4, rook to h8, attacking the h3 pawn. But first, Nepomniachtchi plays g5, check, gaining a tempo on the king, but also creating a protected passer on g5. King to g6, now king to g3 to defend the h3 pawn. The knight goes to b4, hits d3, and now d4 is played, liquidating the weakness and activating the white knights. Pawn takes, knight b to d4. And here black plays knight to c5. A better option, apparently, looks to have been knight takes knight, knight takes knight. Now here, Nepomniachtchi has pressure on f5 and is attacking the a5 pawn, and it would be a mistake for Magnus to defend the a5 pawn in this situation, rook to a8, because then after h4, threat of the pawn advance, the pressure on f5 would just be too great. But what he could have done instead was play e5 and begin to mobilize these central pawns, and then black is very much fighting in this endgame. But he played knight to c5, attacking the b3 pawn, which is only defended by the knight at d4 for the moment, but now rook to a5, knight to e4 check, king to g2, the knight goes back to c5, and now rook to b5, and Nepomniachtchi is beginning to take control over the position, indirectly defending b3, attacking the knight on b4. Knight b to d3, b4, kicks the knight, knight to e4. Magnus is 2 pawns down at the moment, but he has very active pieces. Unfortunately, he's about to lose a 3rd pawn, and he is in trouble in this endgame. Knight takes f5, knight to e1 check, king to f1, of course, attacking the knight. And here Magnus plays a neat little trick. He plays rook takes h3, and it looks like he's just hanging this knight on e1. And Nepomniachtchi takes it. But then after rook to h1 check, you'll notice this knight controls these squares, and this knight blocks the square, so he actually has to play the knight back to g1, and rook takes g1 check. And here, black still is at a disadvantage, but has definitely closed the gap a little bit. What Nepomniachtchi should have done, the computers tell us, instead of taking this knight, was just play a knight takes e7 check right here, and he would have had a big advantage. But at the rook g1 check, he plays king to e2, e5. Magnus wants to undermine this g5 pawn. Knight to h4 check, king to h5. Now, according to the computers, Magnus, with his active pieces and pressure on these f4 and g5 pawns, has fought back to full equality. And he has, a little bit under a minute in this blitz game, so he has time to think a little bit in the position. The knight goes to f3, hitting the rook on g1, and the rook goes back to g4, and this gives the advantage back to Nepomniachtchi. The right move here, as it turns out, was knight to c3 check, counterattacking White's rook. I mean, White was already attacking black's rook, but this counterattacks the rook, and after, say, king to d2, the rook can go to g3, then counterattacking the knight, and after king takes, rook f3 check, and this is a holdable rook endgame for black. If instead of king to d2, he went to king to f2, then rook to b1. and he's got to do something about the threat to his rook. And when the rook moves, ef4, and this was also an equal position. But instead, Magnus plays the move rook to g4, and now king to e3. Another winning idea for white would actually be just to play knight takes e5. After pawn takes e5, rook takes e5, and white is winning in this position. The pawns are just too strong compared to the knight. He plays king to e3 instead. The knight goes to c3, hitting the rook. The rook moves to b6, counterattacking the d6 pawn. And this was Magnus's last chance to have a holdable endgame. Pawn takes f4 check would have left him in the fight. But he ended up taking the pawn with the rook. And here Nepomniachtchi plays rook to d6, and now it's over. He has these two beautiful pawns, and he's also threatening all kinds of nastiness with rook to h6 check. Magnus takes the pawn on c4, but now Nepomniachtchi plays rook to h6 check, king to g4, rook to h4 check, and here, with about 35 seconds left on his clock, Magnus resigned. The reason, of course, is when the king moves, rook takes rook. So a really well-played game from Nepomniachtchi. Creative, interesting, a complex endgame that was back and forth. But I think it shows us that Nepomniachtchi can hang with Magnus, and he looks to be a stronger player now even than he was 2 years ago. I'm looking forward to this match. I hope you are too. Join us again soon at Chess Talk. Goodbye.